Dorothy Whitman's arthritic fingers froze on the steering wheel, her breath catching as the auctioneer's voice cut through the October air like a blade. The crowd had gathered around three small figures, standing motionless beside a hand-painted sign that made her stomach lurch. Orphaned farm boys, $50 each, no questions asked. Each child wore a burlap sack tied over his head like some medieval punishment. A woman in the crowd gasped and stepped backward, her purse scattering coins across the dirt. The auctioneer's hammer hung suspended mid-air as whispers rippled through the assembly like wildfire. Dorothy's mind flashed to Michael's empty bedroom, unchanged for 24 years, his baseball glove still waiting on the nightstand. "Going once!" the auctioneer shouted, desperation edging his voice. The smallest boy turned his head toward Dorothy's truck, and through the rough burlap, a child's voice called out with impossible certainty, "Mrs. Whitman?" How could he know her name? How could any of them know she was there? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Dorothy Whitman had spent 68 years learning that life rarely offered second chances, but as she sat in her late husband Earl's rusted Chevy pickup, watching three burlap-hooded children being auctioned like livestock, she wondered if God was testing her faith one final time. The October wind carried the scent of dying corn and desperation through Henderson's auction barn, where farmers sold everything from tractors to dreams when the bank came calling. At 68, Dot should have been worrying about her own survival. The Whitman farm, 47 acres of Nebraska soil that had fed her family for 3 generations, would be seized in exactly 30 days unless she found $47,000. Earl's pension barely covered her diabetes medication, let alone the heating bills that would keep her alive through another brutal Midwest winter. The mason jar hidden beneath her kitchen floorboards contained exactly $247 in crumpled bills and silver coins, every penny she had left in the world. She'd come to the auction to sell Earl's tools, hoping to scrape together enough money for November's heating oil. Instead, she found herself witnessing something that made her 43 years of teaching seem like preparation for this single moment. 3 boys, ages appearing to range from 7 to 14, stood silent and still while grown men bid on their futures like they were farm equipment. The irony wasn't lost on her. Dorothy Whitman, who had taught over 1,200 children to read, write, and dream during her career, had never been able to have a classroom of her own. She and Earl had tried for years before accepting that their house would echo with other people's children's laughter, not their own. The closest they'd come was Michael, sweet red-headed Michael who'd lived with them for 3 months in 1963 when his parents died in a car accident. Then, one September morning, 8-year-old Michael vanished from their front yard while waiting for the school bus. 24 years later, his bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, his baseball glove still holding its shape on the nightstand. Now, watching these 3 boys standing with the resignation of cattle, Dot felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant since Michael's disappearance. It was the same maternal instinct that had made her pack extra sandwiches for hungry students, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to spend her own money on winter coats for children whose parents couldn't afford them. The tallest boy, lean and protective despite his bound hands, kept shifting slightly to shield the younger ones. The middle child stood rigid with the stillness of someone who'd learned that movement brought punishment. But it was the smallest one who made Dot's heart stop. Something about his posture, the tilt of his head, reminded her achingly of Michael. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Do I hear $50 for all 3? Come on, folks, these boys are strong workers, house-trained and quiet as church mice. House-trained, as if they were animals." That's when Dorothy Whitman made the decision that would change 4 lives forever. Dorothy's hand shot up before her mind could stop it. $150 for all three, she called out, her voice carrying across the auction yard with the authority of 4 decades in the classroom. The crowd turned as one, a sea of weathered faces registering shock at the sight of the elderly schoolteacher who'd just bid away her life savings. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Pete Henderson, whose own children Dot had taught to read, squinted at her through the afternoon glare. "Mrs. Whitman, you sure about that bid? That's a lot of responsibility for—" "I said $150, Dot interrupted, stepping down from her truck with the dignity that had made her a legend in Millfield's elementary school. Her arthritis screamed in protest, but she walked toward the platform with measured steps, every eye in the crowd following her progress. "And I want those sacks removed from their heads right now." A murmur rippled through the assembled farmers and townspeople. Jim Patterson, who owned the largest spread outside town, scratched his graying beard. "Dot, what in Sam Hill are you thinking? You can't afford groceries, let alone 3 growing boys." Before she could respond, a man in an expensive suit stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His shoes were too clean for farm country, his smile too practiced. "I'll bid 200, he announced smoothly. "Cash money, right here and now." Something in his tone made Dot's teaching instincts flare, the same warning bell that had helped her identify troubled children for over 4 decades. She'd heard that particular combination of authority and predation before, usually from the kind of adults who saw children as objects rather than souls. 250, she countered, her voice steady despite the mathematical impossibility of her bid. She had exactly $247 to her name, but somehow the numbers felt less important than the way the smallest boy had turned toward her voice. The suit smiled wider, and Dot caught a glimpse of gold teeth. "Lady, you're bidding against someone who can actually pay 300. That's when the smallest boy spoke again, his voice muffled but determined through the burlap. "Please, Mrs. Whitman, we want to go with you." The crowd fell silent. Even the auctioneer's hammer stopped mid-swing. Someone whispered, "How does that child know Dot's name?" Another voice answered, "Ain't no way he could. He's got a sack over his head." Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest, like tumblers falling into place in a lock she'd forgotten she carried. The boy's voice held an accent she recognized, not local Nebraska, but somewhere further south. Yet there was something else, something that made her think of summer afternoons and a red-headed boy who used to help her weed the garden. $400, she declared, her voice carrying the same tone that had silenced countless rowdy classrooms. "And Mr. Henderson, you remove those sacks right now, or I'll report this whole spectacle to the county sheriff as child abuse." Pete Henderson looked nervous. He'd known Dot Whitman since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and when she used that tone, smart people listened. "Now, Mrs. Whitman, these boys came to us this way. We were told not to—" "I don't care what you were told," Dot snapped, climbing the platform steps with grim determination. "No child stands in my presence with a bag over his head like some kind of prisoner." She reached for the rope securing the smallest boy's hood. The man in the suit stepped forward aggressively. "Lady, you don't have $400, and you sure as hell don't have the authority to—" "Actually, she does." The voice came from Marcus Webb, president of Millfield Community Bank, and the man who'd been sending Dot foreclosure notices. He emerged from the crowd with a leather briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitman has been a pillar of this community for over 4 decades. If she says she's good for $400, then she's good for it." Dot stared at Marcus in shock. This was the same man who'd been calling her weekly about her overdue mortgage payments, the same banker who'd suggested she might be happier in assisted living. But there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before, a kind of desperate hope. Pete Henderson glanced between Dot, Marcus, and the increasingly agitated man in the suit. The crowd was growing restless, and several people were starting to mutter about calling the authorities. "Sold to Mrs. "Whitman," he declared quickly, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Now let's get these boys taken care of proper." As Dot's trembling fingers worked at the knots securing the burlap sacks, she heard the man in the suit speaking urgently into a cell phone. "They're compromised. Yes, all three. We need to implement contingency plans immediately." Then he disappeared into the crowd like smoke. But Dot's attention was fixed on the faces being revealed beneath the rough fabric. Three pairs of eyes, each holding different shades of trauma and hope, looked up at her with the wariness of animals who'd learned that kindness often came with a price. The smallest boy, perhaps 7 years old, had dark hair and eyes that seemed far too old for his face. The middle child appeared to be around 11, with sandy hair and artistic fingers that had been bound too tightly. The eldest looked to be 14, tall and lean, with the protective stance of someone who'd learned to shield others from harm. And on the smallest boy's left shoulder, visible through his torn shirt, was a distinctive birthmark, crescent-shaped and dark as a shadow, the same birthmark her nephew Michael had carried. The 20-minute drive to the Whitman farm passed in suffocating silence. Dorothy gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, stealing glances at the three boys huddled in Earl's old pickup truck. The oldest, who'd quietly introduced himself as Samuel but asked to be called Sam, sat rigid against the passenger door, his dark eyes constantly scanning the road behind them as if expecting pursuit. The middle boy, Jacob, pressed himself into the corner of the bench seat, his artistic fingers tracing nervous patterns on his torn jeans. And Benny, sat in the middle, that impossible birthmark still visible through his threadbare shirt, studying Dorothy's profile with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Ma'am," Sam finally spoke, his voice rough with the careful politeness of a child who'd learned that respect might buy safety. "We don't eat much, and we can work. Jake's real good with animals, and Benny learns fast." Dorothy's heart cracked a little more. "You don't need to earn your keep, Samuel. You're children, not farmhands." "But we want to help," Jacob whispered, speaking for the first time since the auction. His voice carried a slight stutter that spoke of deep trauma. "We don't want to be trouble." "The only trouble would be if you thought you weren't wanted here," Dorothy replied, turning into the gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property that had been in Earl's family for 3 generations. The white clapboard house sat nestled among towering oak trees, its wraparound porch sagging slightly but still welcoming. To Dorothy it looked like home. To 3 boys who'd never known stability, it must have looked like a fairy tale. Benny leaned forward suddenly, pressing his small hands against the dashboard. "The red barn," he said with wonder in his voice. "It's just like in the pictures." Dorothy's foot found the brake harder than she'd intended. "What pictures, sweetheart?" But Benny had already spotted something else that made him gasp. "And there's the tire swing, on the big oak tree by the garden." Sam and Jacob exchanged worried glances. Dorothy felt her pulse quicken. The tire swing had been Earl's project for Michael, hung during that brief 3 months when they'd thought they might finally have a son. After Michael's disappearance, Earl had left it hanging as a memorial of sorts. Few people in town even remembered it existed, hidden as it was behind the vegetable garden. "Benny," Sam said carefully, "you've never been here before." "I know," Benny replied, his voice carrying the simple certainty of childhood. "But I remember it anyway." Dorothy parked the truck with shaking hands and helped the boys down from the cab. The late October air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance, the lowing of cattle from Patterson's farm created a peaceful soundtrack that had soothed Dorothy's nerves for decades. But today, peace felt as elusive as the morning mist. Inside the farmhouse, the boys stood uncertainly in the entryway, taking in the lived-in comfort of mismatched furniture and handmade quilts. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace. Dorothy and Earl on their wedding day, Earl in his army uniform, classroom pictures from Dorothy's teaching years, and there, in the place of honor, a school photograph of an 8-year-old boy with red hair and a gap-toothed grin. Benny walked directly to the photograph and stood studying it with the kind of focused attention that made adults uncomfortable. "He looks happy," he said finally. "He was," Dorothy managed, her voice thick with memories. "That was Michael. He lived here for a little while, a long time ago." "What happened to him?" Jacob asked, his artistic eye noting the way the photograph was positioned like a shrine. Dorothy's standard answer had always been that Michael went to live with relatives in California. It was easier than explaining kidnapping and heartbreak to children. But something about these 3 boys, their own obvious trauma, their careful way of moving through space as if expecting the floor to collapse, made her choose honesty instead. "He was taken," she said simply, "by someone who shouldn't have taken him. We never found him." Sam's expression hardened with recognition. "How old was he?" 8. The same age as—" Dorothy looked at Benny, who was still studying Michael's photograph with an intensity that made her nervous. "The same age as me," Benny finished. Then he turned to Dorothy with those 2 old eyes and said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Whitman. He's not lost anymore." Before Dorothy could ask what he meant, the practical needs of 3 hungry, exhausted children took precedence over mysterious statements. She heated leftover vegetable soup, the last of her homemade provisions, and made grilled cheese sandwiches from the final pieces of bread in her freezer. The boys ate with the controlled desperation of children who'd learned not to assume where their next meal might come from. While they ate, Dorothy found herself studying Benny's face in the lamplight. The birthmark was just the beginning. His nose had the same slight upturn as Michael's. His ears sat at the same angle against his head. His hands, small as they were, had the same long fingers that had made Michael such a natural at piano lessons. "Benny," she said carefully, "do you remember your parents?" The boy looked up from his soup, a grilled cheese crust hanging from the corner of his mouth. "My daddy told me stories before he died. About a lady in Nebraska who had a big heart and a bigger house. He said her name was Dorothy, and she taught children to read, and she made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Dorothy's spoon clattered to the table. Earl used to brag about her apple pie to anyone who'd listen, calling it the best in 3 counties in exactly those words. It was a family joke that had never traveled beyond their kitchen. "What was your daddy's name?" she whispered. "David," Benny replied. "David Michael Whitman. He said he was named after someone real important, but he couldn't remember who." The room began to spin. Dorothy gripped the edge of the table, her breath coming in short gasps. Michael's middle name had been David, after Earl's father. If Michael had lived, if he'd grown up and had a son— Sam was on his feet immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. "Ma'am, are you okay?" But Dorothy wasn't okay. She was looking at her grandson, the grandson she'd never known existed, born to the son she'd thought was dead, sitting at her kitchen table eating soup and asking for seconds with the polite hunger of a child who'd known too much want. "Benny," she managed, "how did you know my name at the auction?" The 7-year-old tilted his head thoughtfully. "Daddy always said that if something bad ever happened to him, I should find Dorothy Whitman in Millfield, Nebraska. He said you'd know what to do." He paused, then added with devastating innocence, "I guess something bad finally happened." The first week tested every assumption Dorothy had ever made about her capacity for motherhood. At 68, her body rebelled against the sudden demands of 3 traumatized children who woke screaming from nightmares, who hoarded food in their pockets, and who flinched when she moved too quickly. Her arthritis medication sat forgotten on the kitchen counter as she focused entirely on the impossible task of convincing three broken souls that they were safe. Sam proved to be the family's self-appointed guardian, a 14-year-old who'd learned to think like an adult before he'd finished growing into his gangly frame. He slept with his back against the bedroom door, one eye always open, ready to protect Jacob and Benny from threats that existed only in his traumatized memory. During the day, he shadowed Dorothy with the intensity of a Secret Service agent, watching her hands when she cooked, monitoring her tone when she spoke, cataloging every entrance and exit in the farmhouse. "Ma'am," he said on the third morning, standing at military attention while Dorothy scrambled eggs, "I need to tell you something important." Dorothy looked up from the stove, noting the way his knuckles were white from gripping the back of a kitchen chair. "What is it, sweetheart?" "We're not normal kids. I mean, we don't know how to be normal kids." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his serious demeanor. "Jake hasn't been to real school in 2 years. Benny's never had a birthday party. And He paused, swallowing hard. "I've done things to keep us alive that regular kids don't have to do." Dorothy set down her spatula and turned to face him fully. "Samuel, nothing you did to survive makes you less worthy of love. Do you understand me?" His composure cracked for just a moment, and she caught a glimpse of the terrified child beneath the protective shell. "But what if we mess this up? What if we're too broken to fix?" "Then we'll be broken together," Dorothy replied firmly. "Some of the best people I know are held together with glue and determination. That doesn't make them any less beautiful." Jacob's adjustment took a different form entirely. He communicated primarily through art, spending hours with crayons and paper Dorothy had bought during a desperate midnight run to the 24-hour Walmart in the next county. His drawings revealed a sophisticated understanding of perspective and emotion that belonged in a college art program, not in the shaking hands of an 11-year-old boy. But the subject matter made Dorothy's blood run cold. Children in cages, men with cruel faces, and over again, three small figures huddled together against an indistinct darkness. "That's the warehouse in Iowa," Jacob explained quietly one afternoon, pointing to a particularly detailed sketch of a concrete building surrounded by barbed wire. "That's where they kept us before the farm in Kansas, and before that there was a house in Missouri with a basement that smelled like bleach." Dorothy studied the drawing with the careful attention she'd once given to student essays, noting the architectural details that no child should be able to render from memory. "How many places were there, Jacob?" "For me, 7, I think. But Sam's been in more. He's older, and he—" Jacob's voice trailed off, and he reached for a fresh piece of paper. "He protected us. He always protected us." Benny's revelations came in casual comments that hit Dorothy like physical blows. He knew that Earl had proposed to her under the oak tree by the garden, a story she'd never shared with anyone. He hummed lullabies that Michael used to sing, songs Dorothy hadn't heard in 24 years. Most unnervingly, he seemed to know the location of objects in the house that had been moved or hidden since Michael's time. "Why do you keep Grandpa Earl's pocket watch in the flour canister?" he asked one morning while helping Dorothy make pancakes. Dorothy nearly dropped the mixing bowl. Earl's father's pocket watch had been hidden in that canister for 15 years, ever since Dorothy had started worrying about break-ins. "How did you know that was there, honey?" Benny shrugged with the casual acceptance of childhood magic. "Daddy told me about it. He said Grandpa Earl always kept important things where nobody would think to look." He paused in his stirring. "Can I see it sometime?" The financial pressure intensified daily like a vice tightening around Dorothy's chest. Feeding 3 growing boys cost more than her monthly Social Security check. The heating bill alone would consume her savings before November ended. She'd started diluting the milk and serving smaller portions, hoping the boys wouldn't notice. but Sam's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Ma'am, you're not eating enough," he observed during dinner on the sixth night, when Dorothy had claimed she wasn't hungry and given her portion to Jacob. "I'm fine, Samuel, just not much appetite lately." "You're lying," he said bluntly, but without disrespect. "You're trying to make sure we have enough, but if you get sick, what happens to us?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Dorothy had been asking herself the same thing every night as she lay awake calculating and recalculating their impossible budget. The mortgage payment was due in 23 days, the heating oil tank was nearly empty, and somewhere in the back of her mind she could hear Earl's voice asking if she'd lost her mind, taking on more than she could handle. The breaking point came on Sunday morning when Dorothy opened the front door to find Helen Morrison, caseworker for the county's Department of Children and Family Services, standing on the porch with a clipboard and a disapproving expression. Morrison was a thin woman in her 40s, with the kind of sharp angles that suggested she'd never met a regulation she couldn't enforce. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm here for the mandatory welfare check on your 3 acquisitions." Dorothy bristled at the word choice, but stepped aside to let the woman enter. "They're not acquisitions, Miss Morrison. They're children, and their names are Samuel, Jacob, and Benjamin." Morrison's inspection was thorough and humiliating. She measured the square footage of the bedrooms, checked the expiration dates on food in the refrigerator, and interrogated the boys with questions designed to reveal neglect or abuse. Sam answered everything with careful politeness. Jacob barely spoke above a whisper, and Benny watched the proceedings with an analytical expression that made Morrison increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitman," Morrison said finally, snapping her clipboard shut, "you're a 68-year-old widow living on a fixed income. These boys have no documentation of their medical history, educational background, or legal status. The state recommends that children with their level of trauma be placed with trained foster families who have experience with—" "No." The word came from Sam, spoken with such quiet authority that Morrison actually stepped backward. "We're not going anywhere. Young man, the decision of placement isn't yours to—" "We choose her," Jacob added, speaking louder than Dorothy had ever heard him. "She doesn't hit us or lock us in closets or make us do things we don't want to do. She makes us pancakes and reads us stories and doesn't sell us to strange men for money." Morrison's expression shifted from bureaucratic efficiency to something approaching alarm. "Sell you? What are you talking about?" Benny looked up from the drawing he'd been working on throughout the interview. "The bad people," he said matter-of-factly. "They buy kids and sell kids like we're corn or chickens. But Mrs. Whitman doesn't want to sell us. She wants to keep us." "I see." Morrison's voice had gone very quiet. "And how long were you with these bad people?" "Forever," Benny replied. "Until Mrs. Whitman saved us." Morrison spent another hour documenting the boys' statements with the grim efficiency of someone who'd heard similar stories too often. When she finally left, she promised to return in 2 weeks for another evaluation, and Dorothy could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, wheels that might very well result in the boys being removed for their own protection. That night, Dorothy found Sam sitting on the front porch steps, staring out at the star-filled Nebraska sky with the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him with a groan from her arthritic knees. "She's going to take us away, isn't she?" Sam asked without looking at her. Dorothy wanted to lie, to offer false reassurance, but something about this boy demanded honesty. "She might try, but I won't let her take you without a fight." "What if the fight isn't enough?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What if we end up somewhere worse?" Dorothy reached over and took his hand, noting the calluses and scars that told the story of his short, hard life. "Then we'll face it together. All 4 of us." "But what if—" "Samuel!" Dorothy's voice carried the authority of 4 decades in the classroom. "Look at me. When he did, she saw the terrified child he'd been trying so hard to hide. "I didn't survive 43 years of teaching, the loss of my son, and your grandfather's death just to give up on you three now. You're family, and families don't abandon each other." The next morning brought a new crisis that would test Dorothy's resolve in ways she couldn't have imagined. She woke to find Jacob collapsed on the bathroom floor, his skin burning with fever and his stomach rigid with pain. Sam was already there, applying cold washcloths with the efficiency of someone who'd provided medical care before. "How long has he been sick?" Dorothy asked, dropping to her knees beside the pale boy. "He started complaining about stomach pain yesterday, but he didn't want to worry you," Sam replied. "I think it's his appendix. I've seen it before." The drive to Millfield General Hospital took 18 minutes that felt like hours. Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness in the back seat while Sam held his hand and Benny sat silent and terrified in the front passenger seat. Dorothy's mind raced through the financial implications. Emergency room visits, surgery, hospital stays, all costs that would push her deeper into debt she couldn't afford. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the emergency room physician, confirmed Sam's diagnosis within minutes of examination. "Acute appendicitis. We need to operate immediately, or the appendix could rupture and cause life-threatening complications." Dorothy signed the consent forms with shaking hands, knowing that each signature was likely adding thousands of dollars to a debt she had no way of paying. But as she watched Jacob's pale face on the gurney being wheeled toward surgery, money seemed like the least important thing in the world. The surgery took 2 hours. Dorothy, Sam, and Benny waited in the sterile hospital corridor, drinking bitter coffee from vending machines and trying to pretend they weren't terrified. Sam paced like a caged animal, his protective instincts frustrated by his inability to fix this particular crisis. Benny drew pictures of doctors and nurses, his artistic interpretation somehow managing to make the medical equipment look friendly rather than frightening. When Dr. Hayes finally emerged from the operating room, her smile was the most beautiful thing Dorothy had seen in weeks. "Jacob came through beautifully," she announced. "The appendix was inflamed but hadn't ruptured. He'll need to stay here for a couple of days for observation, but he should make a full recovery." Dorothy felt her knees go weak with relief. Sam actually sagged against the wall, the tension leaving his body all at once. Benny looked up from his drawing and announced with perfect confidence, "I knew he'd be okay." Families take care of each other. But as Dorothy looked at the preliminary hospital bill, $3,847 for surgery and overnight care, she realized that her determination to keep her family together was about to collide with the harsh mathematics of poverty. She had exactly $23 left in her checking account, and the mortgage payment was due in 17 days. That night, she sat at Earl's old desk writing a letter she'd never thought she'd have to write, swallowing her pride and asking her sister in California for a loan she had no way to repay. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows of the house that might not be hers much longer, and upstairs 2 boys slept peacefully in beds that might soon belong to strangers. But Dorothy Whitman had survived worse losses than money, and as she sealed the envelope and said a prayer to whatever force had brought these children to her door, she made a promise that would define the rest of her life. She would not let fear win. Not this time. The climax arrived on October 31st, Halloween morning, with the cruel irony of a foreclosure notice delivered by a man dressed as death itself. Marcus Webb stood on Dorothy's front porch in his banker's suit, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies and holding a manila envelope that contained the legal end of everything she'd fought to build. Behind him, a small crowd had gathered in the driveway. Neighbors, reporters, and curiosity seekers drawn by the spectacle of an elderly woman's dreams being auctioned on the courthouse steps. "Dot," Marcus said, his voice carrying the uncomfortable formality of friendship strained by business. "You know why I'm here." The foreclosure auction is scheduled for 2 o'clock. I'm required to serve you with final notice." Dorothy took the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking sometime during the sleepless night. She'd already made her peace with losing the farm. What terrified her was losing the boys, who stood behind her in the doorway like a small army preparing for battle. Sam's jaw was set with the kind of determination that made him look far older than 14. Jacob clutched a manila folder containing his artistic documentation of trafficking locations, evidence that might help save other children even if it couldn't save their home. Benny held Dorothy's free hand with the fierce grip of a 7-year-old who'd already lost too much. "Mrs. Whitman?" called out Janet Morrison from KETV News, her camera crew positioning themselves for the best angle. "How do you feel about losing your family farm to take care of 3 boys you've known for less than a month?" The question hit Dorothy like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it forced her to confront the mathematics of her choice. The farm represented 3 generations of Whitman legacy, 47 acres of rich Nebraska soil that had survived the Dust Bowl, the Depression, and 2 world wars. The boys represented an uncertain future with 3 traumatized children who might never fully heal from their experiences. "Those boys are worth more than any piece of land," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying across the crowd with the authority that had commanded respect in countless classrooms. "A farm is just dirt and buildings. Family is forever." But even as she spoke the words, Dorothy felt the weight of what she was losing. Earl's workshop, where he'd built furniture with his own hands. The garden where she'd grown vegetables for the church potluck suppers. Michael's room, preserved exactly as he'd left it 24 years ago. All of it would be sold to strangers who would never know the love and loss that had shaped every corner of the property. The crowd began to move toward town for the auction, but Dorothy lingered on the porch, memorizing the view from the place where she'd planned to grow old with Earl. The red barn, where they'd stored hay for cattle they no longer owned. The tire swing that had waited 2 decades for children to use it again. The oak tree where Earl had proposed on a spring evening in 1945, promising her a lifetime of simple happiness. "Grandma Dot," Benny said quietly, tugging on her coat sleeve, "I need to show you something important." He led her to Michael's bedroom, the shrine she'd maintained through 24 years of grief and hope. Benny walked directly to the corner where Michael's old toy chest sat, its painted soldiers and cowboys faded but still recognizable. He knelt down and pressed against a loose floorboard that Dorothy had never noticed, revealing a hiding space beneath. "Daddy told me about this," Benny explained, reaching into the hollow and pulling out a small metal box. "He said if something ever happened to him, I should show you what Uncle Michael left behind." Dorothy's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a child's diary with a broken lock, and a photograph she'd never seen before. Michael, at perhaps 15 or 16 years old, standing next to a young woman holding a baby. On the back, someone had written in Michael's careful handwriting, "David Michael, born June 15, 1979. He has Mama Dot's eyes." "Michael lived," Dorothy whispered, the words barely audible. "He grew up. He had a son." Sam and Jacob crowded into the room as Dorothy read Michael's letters aloud, her voice breaking with each revelation. He'd been held captive for 5 years before escaping at age 13. He'd lived on the streets, aged out of foster care, struggled with addiction and homelessness. But he'd also found love briefly with a girl named Sarah who died in childbirth. He'd raised their son David alone until a car accident took his life when David was 16. "David was my father," Benny said simply, "and before he died he told me stories about the grandmother in Nebraska who taught children to read and made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you." The final letter was dated just months before Michael's death in 1995. Mama Dot, if you're reading this, it means David found you like I always hoped he would. I know I can't come home. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. But maybe my son can have the childhood I never got to finish. Take care of him for me. Tell him his father loved him enough to send him to the safest place in the world, your kitchen table. Dorothy was still crying when Marcus Webb returned an hour later, his expression grim with the duty he was about to perform. Dot, I'm sorry, but it's time. The auction starts in 30 minutes. Mr. Webb, Sam said, stepping forward with the formal politeness that had kept him alive through years of dangerous situations. Before you take our home away, you should know that Mrs. Whitman saved us from people who buy and sell children like livestock. She spent her life savings to keep us out of slavery. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Son, I understand this is difficult, but do you have children, sir? Jacob interrupted, speaking with more confidence than Dorothy had ever heard from him. I do. 2 daughters. Jacob opened his art folder and spread drawings across the kitchen table. Children in cages, men with cruel faces, buildings that looked like prisons. This is what was going to happen to us. This is what happens to kids nobody wants. Mrs. Whitman wanted us. Marcus studied the drawings with growing horror, his banker's composure cracking as he recognized the artistic skill required to create such detailed documentation. My God. Are these real places? Every one, Sam confirmed. And there are more kids still trapped there. But Mrs. Whitman chose to save us instead of saving her farm. Benny climbed onto a kitchen chair so he could look Marcus directly in the eye. My daddy said the most important thing in the world is family. He said buildings can be rebuilt, but love lost is gone forever. He paused, then added with devastating 7-year-old logic, Mrs. Whitman chose love. Marcus Webb, president of Millfield Community Bank and executor of 36 foreclosures over his 20-year career, sat down heavily at Dorothy's kitchen table and put his head in his hands. Dot, what you've done it's remarkable, but I can't stop the foreclosure. The bank has investors, regulations, obligations. I understand, Marcus, Dorothy said quietly. You have your job to do. But what will happen to you? To the boys? Dorothy had been asking herself the same question for weeks. Social services would likely place the boys in separate foster homes. At 68, she might qualify for subsidized senior housing, a 1-bedroom apartment where she'd live alone with her memories and her regrets. The family she'd finally found would be scattered to the winds by bureaucracy and economics. We'll figure it out, she said, though she had no idea how. That's when the miracle began. The first car pulled into the driveway at 1:30, disgorging the entire Peterson family from down the road. Bill Peterson had been Earl's closest friend, and his wife Martha had taught alongside Dorothy for 15 years. They climbed out of their pickup truck carrying a coffee can full of cash and determined expressions. Dot, Martha Peterson announced, we've been talking to folks around town. What you did for these boys. It's what any decent person should do. And decent people don't let their neighbors lose their homes for doing right. More cars followed. The entire congregation of Millfield Methodist Church, led by Pastor Jim Henderson, Dorothy's former teaching colleagues, many of them retired and living on fixed incomes themselves. Farm families who'd known the Whitmans for 3 generations. Even some of her former students, now adults with children of their own, who remembered the teacher who'd believed in them when no one else would. By 2 o'clock, when the auction was scheduled to begin, more than 200 people had gathered in Dorothy's front yard. They came with cash, with checks, with IOUs written on scraps of paper. Children emptied piggy banks. Teenagers offered lawn mowing money. Veterans pledged disability payments. The elderly brought Social Security checks they couldn't afford to give, but couldn't afford not to. Pastor Henderson climbed onto Dorothy's front porch and addressed the crowd with the authority of a man who'd delivered 40 years of sermons. Friends, we're here today because Dorothy Whitman showed us what real faith looks like. Not the kind you practice on Sundays, but the kind you live every day. She chose love over comfort, sacrifice over security, hope over fear. He gestured toward Sam, Jacob, and Benny, who stood beside Dorothy with expressions of wonder and disbelief. These boys were being sold like cattle at Henderson's auction barn. Dorothy Whitman saw 3 children who needed a champion, and she chose to be that champion. Today, we're here to be hers. The impromptu fundraising took on the energy of a revival meeting. People shared stories of Dorothy's kindness over the decades. The Christmas presents she'd bought for children whose families couldn't afford them, the tutoring she'd provided free of charge, the way she'd stayed after school to help struggling students long after her contract required. Marcus Webb watched the proceedings with growing amazement, his banker's calculator clicking as donations poured in. $50 here, 20 there, a few hundred from more prosperous families. It seemed impossible that such small amounts could add up to the $47,000 needed to save the farm. But by 3 o'clock, when Pastor Henderson counted the final total, the impossible had become reality. $52,437, enough to pay off the mortgage with money left over for the boys' immediate needs. Dorothy stood in her front yard, surrounded by the community that had been her life's work, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's disappearance: the absolute certainty that she was not alone. These people, farmers and teachers, mechanics and shop owners, children and grandparents, had chosen to see her struggle as their own. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd that had refused to let her fall. "You already did," called out Sarah Martinez, one of Dorothy's former students who now taught at the same elementary school. "You showed us what love looks like in action." As the crowd began to disperse, promising to return for a celebration dinner the following Sunday, Dorothy realized that the miracle wasn't just financial. For the first time in 24 years, she had more than a house. She had a home filled with the laughter of children who called her grandma, surrounded by a community that had proven family extends far beyond blood relations. But even as Dorothy celebrated the victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. The man in the expensive suit from the auction had never been identified, and Helen Morrison's connections to suspected trafficking operations remained uninvestigated. The boys were safe for now, but somewhere out there, other children were still trapped in the network that had nearly claimed Sam, Jacob, and Benny. The fight for family was won. The fight for justice was just beginning. The tragedy struck on a cold November morning when Dorothy believed they had finally found peace. 3 weeks had passed since the community saved the farm, 3 weeks of cautious happiness as the boys settled into routines that felt almost normal. Sam had started high school and surprised everyone, including himself, by excelling in every subject. Jacob's nightmares had decreased, and he'd begun teaching art classes to younger children at the community center. Benny had thrown himself into first grade with the enthusiasm of a child who'd never had the chance to learn alongside peers his own age. Dorothy woke that Tuesday to the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, a sound that in rural Nebraska usually meant farm accidents or house fires. She made coffee and started breakfast, humming contentedly as she watched frost patterns on the kitchen windows. The boys were still asleep upstairs, teenagers and 7-year-olds alike treasuring those extra minutes under warm quilts before facing another day. The knock on the door came at 7:15, sharp and urgent. Detective Ray Sullivan stood on her porch with an expression that made Dorothy's stomach drop. Behind him, 2 FBI agents in dark suits looked like harbingers of doom against the cheerful autumn decorations still hanging from Halloween. "Dot, we need to talk," Ray said without preamble. It's about the boys. They gathered in the living room while Sam, Jacob, and Benny ate breakfast in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the thin walls with the easy chatter of children who finally felt safe. Detective Sullivan spread photographs across Dorothy's coffee table, surveillance images that made her blood run cold. The man who bid against you at the auction, Sullivan explained, pointing to a grainy photo of the well-dressed stranger. His name is Vincent Morrison. He's Helen Morrison's brother, and they're both part of what the FBI calls the Morrison Network, one of the largest child trafficking operations in the Midwest. Dorothy studied the photographs with growing horror. Images of warehouses, farms, and nondescript buildings that could have been anywhere. Lists of names and dates that represented children bought and sold like cattle. Financial records showing transactions in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vincent Morrison has been moving children through a network of auctions, private sales, and fake adoptions for over 15 years, FBI agent Catherine Nash explained. When you disrupted their operation by buying the boys, you created a significant problem for them. A problem worth killing for, added Agent David Chen grimly. 3 other families who've interfered with Morrison operations have died in what appeared to be accidents. House fires, car crashes, carbon monoxide poisoning. Dorothy felt the room spinning around her. Are you saying we're in danger? We're saying you've been in danger since the moment you raised your hand at that auction, Sullivan replied. The only reason you're still alive is because the community response made you too visible to eliminate quietly. The next revelation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. The FBI had been investigating the Morrison Network for 3 years, building a case that required witnesses, specifically children who could testify about the scope and methods of the trafficking operation. Sam, Jacob, and Benny weren't just survivors. They were key witnesses whose testimony could bring down an organization that had destroyed hundreds of lives. The Justice Department wants to offer the boys protection in exchange for their cooperation, Agent Nash explained. New identities, relocation to a secure facility, round-the-clock security. Separate from you, Agent Chen added quietly. Dorothy's heart stopped. What do you mean, separate? The boys would need to be placed in federal protective custody until the trials conclude. That could take 18 months to 2 years. You wouldn't be able to see them or communicate with them during that time. From the kitchen came the sound of Jacob laughing at something Benny had said, a rare sound that had taken weeks to coax from the traumatized boy. Sam's voice joined in, teasing and protective in equal measure. These were the sounds Dorothy had prayed for during those long nights when she'd wondered if the boys would ever feel safe enough to simply be children. They've been through enough, Dorothy said firmly. I won't let you separate this family. Mrs. Whitman, Agent Nash said gently, we understand your attachment to these children, but there are 47 other kids still trapped in the Morrison Network. The boys' testimony could save them. Sullivan leaned forward, his expression pained. I've seen what these people do to witnesses who don't cooperate. Vincent Morrison has connections to organized crime, corrupt officials, and people who make problems disappear permanently. The weight of the decision crushed down on Dorothy's shoulders. Save 3 boys who'd already suffered more than any children should, or sacrifice their newfound security to potentially save dozens of others still trapped in nightmare situations. Either choice meant losing the family she'd fought so hard to build. The morning took a darker turn when Agent Chen's phone rang with news that made him curse under his breath. Vincent Morrison had been arrested in a pre-dawn raid, but he'd managed to destroy most of his records before being taken into custody. Without the boys' detailed testimony about locations, methods, and other victims, the prosecution's case would collapse. He'll be released on bail within 48 hours, Agent Nash explained grimly. His lawyers are already claiming the auction was a legitimate business transaction, and without witness testimony to prove otherwise, a jury might believe him. Dorothy found herself in an impossible position. If the boys testified, they'd be separated from her for years and forced to relive their worst memories in courtrooms full of strangers. If they didn't testify, Vincent Morrison would walk free and continue destroying children's lives, possibly including theirs if he decided they were too dangerous to leave alive. The conversation was interrupted by Sam appearing in the doorway, his teenage face drawn with worry. "Ma'am? Is everything okay? Jake heard you talking about testimony and trials, and Benny's asking if we have to go away again." Dorothy looked at this boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd protected his chosen brothers through horrors she could barely imagine, and realized the decision wasn't hers to make. "Come sit down, Samuel. All of you. We need to talk as a family." When all three boys were gathered in the living room, listening with the serious attention of children who'd learned that adult conversations often determined their fate, Dorothy explained the situation as gently as possible. She watched their faces as understanding dawned. They could help save other children, but only by sacrificing the security they'd just begun to trust. "How many kids are still trapped?" Sam asked quietly. "At least 47 that we know of," Agent Nash replied. "Probably more." Sam looked at Jacob and Benny, some silent communication passing between them. "And if we don't testify, the bad people go free?" "Most likely, yes." Jacob spoke up, his voice stronger than Dorothy had ever heard it. "What happens to us if we say yes?" "You'd be moved to a secure facility," Agent Chen explained. "Safe, but separate from Mrs. Whitman until the trials end." Benny climbed onto Dorothy's lap, his small face serious beyond his years. "Grandma Dot, what do you think we should do?" Dorothy held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the lingering sweetness of maple syrup from breakfast. "I think," she said carefully, "that you boys have already sacrificed enough. Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely." The three boys exchanged another look, and Dorothy saw something pass between them, a shared understanding forged by suffering and strengthened by love. When Sam spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been making life or death decisions since he was barely older than Benny. "We'll do it," he said simply. "We'll testify, but we want Mrs. Whitman to come with us." "That's not possible," Agent Nash began, but Sam cut her off. "Then we don't testify," he said with finality. "We're a family now. Families stick together." Dorothy felt her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. These boys, who'd been bought and sold and treated as property, were choosing to risk their newfound safety to save other children, but they were also refusing to abandon the only real family they'd ever known. The tragedy wasn't that the boys would have to testify. The tragedy was that children who'd already lost their innocence were being asked to lose their childhood as well, sacrificing their healing to become weapons in someone else's war for justice. But as Dorothy held Benny close and watched Sam and Jacob's determined faces, she realized that this family had already survived worse separations than federal custody could impose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The reversal began with a phone call that would change everything Dorothy thought she knew about her grandson's past. 3 days after the FBI's devastating visit, while she sat at the kitchen table trying to prepare the boys for what lay ahead, Detective Sullivan called with news that made her drop the receiver. "Dot, you need to sit down for this." Ray's voice crackled through the old rotary phone that Earl had installed in 1967. "We found David Whitman's birth certificate, Benny's father, and there's something you need to know about how he died." Dorothy's hands trembled as she picked up the phone. Sam, Jacob, and Benny looked up from their homework, sensing the gravity in her voice. "What do you mean, how he died?" "David didn't die in a car accident like Benny was told. He was murdered, Dot." Shot execution style in a Denver alley in 1995. The case went cold, but we just connected it to Vincent Morrison through ballistics evidence that was never properly analyzed. The room began to spin. Dorothy gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. "Are you saying Vincent Morrison killed Benny's father?" "It gets worse. David was working undercover for a victims advocacy group documenting trafficking networks and gathering evidence. Morrison found out and had him eliminated. The car accident story was a cover-up to protect Benny from becoming a target." Benny looked up from his coloring book, his 7-year-old face creased with worry. "Grandma Dot, why are you crying?" Dorothy couldn't answer. The revelation that her grandson had been murdered by the same man who'd tried to buy Benny at auction created a symmetry of evil that took her breath away. Michael had been stolen as a child, survived captivity, built a life, and passed his hope to a son who'd tried to fight back against the system that had destroyed their family. Now that son was dead, and his killer was walking free on bail, probably planning his next move. "There's more," Sullivan continued. "David kept detailed records of his investigation. We found them hidden in a safety deposit box in Colorado. Names, locations, financial records, everything we need to bring down the entire Morrison network. But here's the thing, Dot. Benny was with David when he gathered most of this evidence. That boy has seen more trafficking operations than any of our undercover agents." The implications hit Dorothy like a freight train. Benny wasn't just a victim or a witness, he was the key to everything. His innocent questions about their travels, his detailed knowledge of seemingly random locations, his ability to draw maps of places he'd supposedly never been. It all made terrible sense now. David had been training his son to remember, to survive, to carry on the fight if something happened to him. "How much does Benny remember?" Dorothy asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "More than he realizes. David used memory techniques to help him retain information without understanding its significance. Games, songs, stories, all designed to preserve evidence in a child's mind." Sam had been listening to Dorothy's half of the conversation with growing alarm. He stood up from the table, his teenage frame tense with protective instincts. "Ma'am, what's happening? What's wrong?" Dorothy looked at this boy who'd already sacrificed so much to protect his chosen family, and realized she was about to ask him to sacrifice even more. "Samuel, I need you to get Jacob and take Benny upstairs for a few minutes. There are some things I need to understand." But Benny shook his head, his small voice carrying unexpected authority. "No, Grandma Dot. I need to hear this too. I know more than you think I do." The next hour brought revelations that transformed Dorothy's understanding of everything that had happened since the auction. Benny, with the matter-of-fact clarity of childhood, began recounting memories he'd kept hidden out of some instinctive understanding that knowledge could be dangerous. He remembered traveling with his father to dozens of locations across the Midwest, always staying in different motels, always moving at night. David had taught him to memorize addresses, license plate numbers, and architectural details through games and rhymes. He remembered drawing pictures for his father, pictures that were actually maps of trafficking facilities disguised as a child's artwork. "Daddy said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you and tell you about the special pictures," Benny explained, pulling a worn notebook from his backpack. "But I wasn't supposed to tell anyone else until I was sure you were safe." The notebook contained dozens of drawings that looked like innocent childhood art, but were actually detailed surveillance reports. Buildings, faces, vehicle descriptions, and schedules, all rendered with the photographic memory of a child trained to observe and remember. Jacob studied the drawings with his artist's eye, pointing out details that made his own trafficking documentation look amateur by comparison. "Benny, these places, I recognize some of them. This warehouse in Kansas City, this farm outside Topeka. You've been to all of these?" "Daddy and I were making a map," Benny replied simply. "He said someday someone would use it to save all the other kids." Sam's expression had gone from protective to thunderstruck. "Benny, do you understand what this means? You're not just a witness, you're the witness. You have evidence that could shut down trafficking operations in 12 states. Dorothy felt the weight of destiny settling on her small family like a shroud. The FBI's request for testimony had just transformed from a plea for justice into a moral imperative. Benny wasn't just being asked to help save other children. He was carrying the final mission of a father who died trying to destroy the system that had stolen his own childhood. The phone rang again. This time it was Agent Nash, with news that made Dorothy's blood run cold. Vincent Morrison had been released on bail and had disappeared. His ankle monitor had been found cut off in a parking garage in Omaha. Worse, 3 other key witnesses in custody had died in what appeared to be coordinated accidents: a gas leak, a car crash, and a mysterious heart attack. Mrs. Whitman, you and the boys are in immediate danger, Agent Nash said without preamble. Morrison knows about Benny's father now, and he'll connect the dots. You need to come into protective custody immediately. Dorothy looked around her kitchen. Earl's coffee cup still sitting on the counter, the boys' homework spread across the table they'd eaten family dinners at for just over a month, the mason jar that had once held her life savings now serving as a pencil holder. This house had been her anchor through every storm life had thrown at her. Leaving it felt like surrendering the last piece of her old life. But as she watched Sam help Benny pack his precious notebook, and Jacob carefully rolling up the drawings that might save dozens of children, Dorothy realized that home wasn't a place anymore. Home was these 3 boys who'd chosen to call her Grandma, who'd transformed her empty house into a sanctuary of second chances. "How long do we have?" she asked Agent Nash. "A van will pick you up in 30 minutes. Pack only essentials, clothes, medications, important documents. Everything else will have to stay behind." The next 25 minutes passed in a blur of frantic packing and tearful goodbyes to a life they'd barely had time to build. Dorothy grabbed the photograph of Michael and Earl, her wedding ring, and the quilt her mother had made. Sam packed his school books with the determination of someone who refused to let circumstances derail his education. Jacob carefully wrapped his art supplies in the drawings that documented his own survival. Benny clutched a stuffed rabbit that Earl had won at a county fair 30 years ago and had been waiting in Michael's room for the right child to claim it. As they waited for the federal marshals to arrive, Dorothy gathered the boys in the living room for what might be their last moment of peace together. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows that looked out over the farm that had been in Earl's family for 3 generations, casting golden light on furniture that held the memories of a lifetime. "I want you boys to understand something," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Whatever happens next, whatever we have to face, we're facing it as a family. You didn't just save my life when you came here, you saved my soul. And now we're going to save some other children's souls, too." Sam reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlocking with her arthritic ones. "We know, Grandma Dot, and we're not scared anymore." "Why not?" Dorothy asked. Jacob smiled, the first truly peaceful expression she'd seen on his face since the auction. "Because we finally found what we were looking for." "What's that?" Benny climbed onto her lap one last time, his small arms circling her neck with the fierce love of a child who'd learned the difference between people who hurt and people who heal. "A family that doesn't give up," he whispered into her ear. "Daddy said that was the most powerful thing in the world." Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the beginning of a new chapter in their story. Dorothy Whitman, who'd started the day as a retired teacher living quietly on a Nebraska farm, was about to become the guardian of the most important witnesses in the largest child trafficking case in federal history. But she was also about to discover that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as the most devastating losses. 2 years later, Dorothy Whitman stood in the kitchen of a house that had never quite felt like home, watching snow fall on a Nebraska landscape that looked exactly like the one she'd been forced to leave behind. The federal safe house in Grand Island was comfortable enough, 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and neighbors who believed the Whitmans were a retired teacher and her 3 grandsons starting fresh after a family tragedy. It was a good cover story because it was mostly true. The trials had ended 6 months earlier with convictions that dismantled the Morrison network completely. Vincent Morrison received life without parole. His sister Helen got 25 years. 47 children were rescued from trafficking operations across 12 states, and the evidence Benny had carried in his innocent drawings led to the arrest of over 200 conspirators. The Justice Department called it the most successful anti-trafficking operation in federal history. But victory had come at a cost that Dorothy measured in small daily heartbreaks. Sam was now 16, a junior in high school who'd grown 3 inches and developed the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived testifying in federal court. Jacob, 13, had become something of a local celebrity when his artistic documentation of trafficking sites was featured in a national magazine about child advocacy. And Benny, now 9, read at a high school level and had started writing stories about families who found each other in impossible circumstances. They were thriving by any reasonable measure. But Dorothy could see the ways that 2 years of protective custody had changed them. Sam's protective instincts had evolved into a chronic hypervigilance that made him flinch at unexpected sounds. Jacob's art had grown more sophisticated but also darker, as if success had given him permission to explore the full depth of his trauma. Benny still woke some nights calling for his father, the weight of carrying David's mission having robbed him of some essential innocence. And Dorothy herself had aged more than 2 years in the time they'd been away. The stress of constant security briefings, the isolation from the community that had saved their farm, and the responsibility of raising 3 traumatized children while living under assumed identities had taken a toll she was only beginning to understand. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years and 4 months after they'd left Millfield. Agent Nash, now a family friend as much as a federal contact, called with news that would change everything once again. "Dorothy, it's over," Catherine said without preamble. "The appeals are exhausted, the network is completely dismantled, and Vincent Morrison died in prison last week. Natural causes, heart attack. The Justice Department has officially cleared you for return to normal life." Dorothy sank into the kitchen chair where she'd sat for countless mornings, trying to process what normal life might even mean anymore. What about the boys' safety? With Morrison dead and the network destroyed, there's no ongoing threat. You're free to go wherever you want, live however you choose. The restrictions are lifted. For 2 years, Dorothy had dreamed of this moment. She'd imagined the celebration, the tearful reunion with her old life, the triumphant return to the farmhouse where Earl's memory still lived in every creaking floorboard. But now that freedom was actually within reach, she felt something unexpected, uncertainty. "Can we go home?" Benny asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his backpack slung over his shoulder, ready for another day at Jefferson Elementary School. At 9, he was tall for his age and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned that life could change without warning. "That's what we need to talk about," Dorothy replied, gathering Sam and Jacob for the family meeting that would determine their future. When all 3 boys were seated around the kitchen table that had hosted so many important conversations over the past 2 years, Dorothy spread out the documents Agent Nash had sent over: property records, bank statements, and legal papers that told the story of everything they'd left behind. The Whitman farm had been maintained by the community exactly as they'd left it. Neighbors had taken turns mowing the grass, checking the pipes, and making sure the house didn't fall into disrepair. The mortgage was still paid off, the utilities were still connected, and Dorothy's bedroom still contained the clothes she'd abandoned in their hasty departure. But the boys had built lives in Grand Island. Sam had made friends in his advanced placement classes and was being recruited by colleges that had never heard of Millfield. Jacob had found an art teacher who understood his unique perspective and was helping him prepare portfolio submissions for prestigious summer programs. Benny had discovered a love of writing that flourished in the diverse, urban environment of his current school. "What do you boys want to do?" Dorothy asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complicated than any of them wanted it to be. Sam spoke first, his voice carrying the careful consideration that had made him such an effective witness. "I want to go home," he said, "but I also don't want to go backwards. Does that make sense?" Jacob nodded enthusiastically. "I miss the red barn and the tire swing and the way everything smelled like growing things. But I also like having an art room at school and friends who think my drawings are cool instead of scary." Benny climbed onto Dorothy's lap, a habit he'd never quite outgrown despite being far too big for it. "Grandma Dot, is home a place or is home people?" The question hit Dorothy with the force of revelation. For 2 years, she'd been thinking about home as the farmhouse in Millfield, the place where she'd built a life with Earl and lost it after his death, the place where she'd found the boys and briefly built a family before being forced to flee. But sitting in this kitchen in Grand Island, watching 3 boys who called her Grandma navigate the complexity of belonging, she realized that home had never been about geography. Home was Sam teaching Benny to ride a bicycle in the driveway of their safe house. Home was Jacob hanging his artwork on the refrigerator and asking Dorothy's opinion about color choices. Home was family dinners around a table that had never belonged to Earl but had still become the center of their universe. Home was the sound of 3 boys arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes, the comfort of bedtime stories that had evolved from picture books to complex discussions about justice and forgiveness and the possibility of healing. "Home is people," Dorothy said finally, "but sometimes people need a place that helps them remember who they are." They spent the next 2 weeks making plans that honored both their past and their future. They would return to Millfield for the summer, reopening the farmhouse and reconnecting with the community that had saved them. But they would keep the house in Grand Island as well, maintaining the connections and opportunities that had helped them thrive during their time away. Sam would finish high school in Millfield but attend college wherever his talents took him, knowing he had 2 places to call home. Jacob would split his time between both schools, learning from the art teacher who understood his trauma and the community that had first recognized his gift. Benny would spend summers on the farm and school years in Grand Island, bridging 2 worlds with the adaptability that had always been his superpower. The decision felt right in a way that surprised Dorothy. For so long, she'd thought healing meant returning to the way things were before. But sitting in that kitchen with 3 boys who'd taught her that family is something you choose rather than something you inherit, she realized that healing actually meant moving forward with wisdom earned through suffering, carrying the best of the past while remaining open to the possibilities of the future. On their last night in the Grand Island house, Dorothy tucked each boy into beds they'd slept in for 2 years, kissing foreheads that had grown more angular and mature during their time away. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to Millfield, but they would go as different people than the ones who'd left in fear and uncertainty. They were going home as a family that had survived the worst the world could offer and had somehow found a way to transform their pain into purpose, their trauma into triumph. They were going home as Dorothy Whitman and her 3 grandsons, carrying the memory of Michael and David and Earl, ready to write the next chapter of a story that had always been about the power of love to heal what seemed irreparably broken. Most importantly, they were going home together. At 68, Dorothy Whitman thought her story was over, a lonely widow rattling around in an empty farmhouse, watching her savings dwindle and her purpose fade. Then 3 broken boys with burlap sacks over their heads changed everything. When that youngest child somehow knew her name, when the community she'd served for 43 years rallied to save her farm, when love proved stronger than fear, Dorothy discovered that some of life's most beautiful chapters begin when we think the book is already closed. This isn't just a story about saving children, it's about how children save us right back. It's about communities that refuse to let good people fall, about the courage to choose love over security, and about families formed not by blood, but by the fierce determination to belong to each other. Dorothy learned that at 68, you can still be someone's hero. You can still build something beautiful from broken pieces. You can still matter in ways that echo through generations. Sometimes our greatest adventures don't begin until we think we're too old for adventures. Sometimes the family we've always needed finds us when we're brave enough to open our hearts to the impossible. What moment in your life surprised you with unexpected joy when you thought your best days were behind you? Have you ever experienced a community coming together to support someone in need? And how did it change your perspective on what really matters? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.